open the fire.
We're away laughing. This is a song
Very good.
It's called Lockdown. It's actually
really?
average, but
fitting.
We thought it was a lockdown. They opened the fire.
There you go.
Vibes. I had to go and put on a jersey because my colleagues here are both looking extremely preppy, coming out of the salubrious suburbs of Tor Bay and Devonport, respectively. How are we, team?
Good, thank you. No days off.
No days off.
Oh yeah.
I'm hanging in there. Lots of trips to Countdown. Lots of Antipodes sparkling water.
Kombucha.
Kombucha. Yeah, I've rationed that a little bit though because I was starting to go through it like it was water, and I'm sure it's got sugar in it, even if it's the healthy sugar.
Gotta watch
Michael,
it.
how you going?
Sorry?
Good.
You there, mate?
Yeah, no, good.
Yep.
Good, thank you, Shane.
What's been going on?
Not a lot. Really very
Broadcasting live from the eye of the storm.
I lost I had a real moment, Liam, when I got that email from our client earlier we were discussing before we came on air, and I got a bit of a shock and I was a bit perturbed, and I dropped my basket with all my stuff in it, and I've dropped my AirPods, and and I think I've lost the case down through the stairwell, but we were, of course, live to come online, so I didn't have time to find the case. So hopefully some good Samaritan realizes that these are no use at all without the case. Yeah, and I've got the older generation ones too. And the problem with that is I think they're the wrong shape unless I cut the ends off, which would work out very well for me.
Maybe you can try to find a donor case somewhere. There must be some sort of place which just has, it's like all those left shoes you find. Someone must have the right one, so you just need to find that person.
Knowing Apple, you'd probably have to pay more for the case than the actual new product.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Right, should we get into it? So we thought we'd get together today and bring the good people that follow our little podcast some information about the various forms of support that are available from the government for businesses, and also talk a little bit about the efficacy, i.e. usefulness of each of those support packages and practical measures that businesses can be taking to limit their downside. And then we're going to finish off with a little segment just talking about if you are in a situation where you're insolvent or you're soon to be insolvent, i.e. your cash flow balance sheet's not looking good and the cash is running out, and you can't quite, like a lot of hospo business owners I know, you can't quite weather the storm any longer. We're going to talk about practical ways that you can, how the sort of legislation sort of, how do I say it, interacts with those practical realities for people. So first of all, so you've got the wage subsidy again, you've got something called the Resurgence COVID? RSP, which is $1,500 per business and $400 per full-time employee. I think that one to have a decline of 30%, and for over the last 7 days. And for the wage subsidy, you needed to have a decline of, I believe it's 40% over in the last 7 days, or would expect to have a reduction of that amount. So it's the same rules as before. Apparently, the ministries that administer the packages, Ministry of Social Development and IRD, apparently going to be more, the word was assiduous in policing, although we put ours through this morning and it seemed to be approved pretty quickly. So whether it's true or not, maybe the follow-up will be more assiduous in terms of methodically checking through all the key parameters, GST returns, the fact that the employees, believe it or not, have valid IRD numbers entered in, and making sure that you are bona fide, that you comply with the letter of the law. It can't be, Robertson was on the radio, I think yesterday on Radio New Zealand, talking about how, yes, in an ideal world, it would have been approached more intellectually and maybe on a more principally sound basis in terms of apportioning the various packages on a first, how do you say it, on a who deserves it more basis. But he said that at the short time frame that they've had to administer the packages, that hasn't been possible. and whether or not that is true, given the time they've had now to actually foresee that these things are coming through. And I know a lot of hospital owners out there would be thinking, shit, why are they paying lawyers and accountants these packages when we literally can't open our doors and trade at all? Like people like us, our trade is obviously significantly down, way further down than what is required for a subsidy. But do professionals such as us or accountants or other paper pushers, are we really deserving, equally with hospital owners? I would say no. Guys,
no.
Talk to that at all?
I can speak a little to the way that IRD is taking this somewhat more seriously. I also applied a few days ago, and I got a call from IRD asking them to call them to talk about it. I called them and got told that they would call me to ask for further evidence about it. So it's been certainly a convoluted process to date.
Is this for the wage subsidy?
Yeah, yet to see exactly what they require. I imagine, Shane, it'll be the sort of thing you're talking about, some sort of evidence of what your turnover has been, and then your projections, presumably.
I presume that you also would have had that treatment because your business wasn't around prior to April 2020.
That's correct. It's a function of being a reasonably recently trading business.
Because I just don't want every Tom, Dick,
so
and
their
Harry
energies are probably
coming out and filing for subsidies when they're trying to make sure it's a legitimate business, which it almost is, right?
Reasonably so.
The air
remains to be seen. Yeah. Plausible deniability.
Yeah. So that's the wage subsidy stuff. There's also some more payments for where, I don't know what the handle is for each one, but where employees can't need to self-isolate and can't actually work from home. So I'm assuming a hospital business, maybe manufacturing, something like that. And there is other support. Believe it or not, if employees use their home phone, the business can get $15 contribution to the cost of that. I don't even know if you worth your time filing for it. I was reading that with the tea. I was going, that's it's generous and everything.
Guess it all counts.
Yes, it all adds up. Yeah, but what I want to talk about in a little bit more depth, and Liam and Mike and I have all looked into, and I think we're doing various articles on the topic, is this business debt hibernation scheme. So Liam, you had a little bit of a look into that. Do you want to give us a little précis on exactly what that is?
Yeah, so basically it was brought in last year as a response to sort of the liquidity issues a couple of these businesses, or quite a few businesses, are facing, along with sort of a safe harbor from some directors' duties. Now that's expired, but yes, the regime's still around. And basically it offers directors just a bit of breathing.
The director's duty, but that safe harbor for directors has expired, hasn't it? But the regime has been extended until October 31, 2021.
And so that basically gives them a bit of breathing room, basically to put a moratorium on claims, which is basically saying no one can really enforce sort of a legal debt against them for a month. And in that month, you're meant to sort of come to an arrangement with these creditors, basically saying, look, these are the issues that I'm facing, and trying to come to some sort of arrangement or proposal with these creditors moving forward, with the main goal that basically everyone is going to try get as much of their debt solved as possible. And if that gets approved, then that sort of hold on claims goes for another 6 months. So you're looking at possibly up to 7 months.
And all the creditors agree, don't they, for it to be extended for 6 months?
No, 50% of the creditors and 50% of the value. So both of them.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's important that you obviously get the big ticket creditors, which are often going to be things like banks. One caveat that is important to appreciate, though, is that this doesn't the protections don't apply to generally secure. So say a bank has a GSA over your assets, this protection that actually falls outside this regime. So they'll still be able to step in and appoint a receiver or a liquidator if need be.
in almost, if not every case, a bank, all our clients, commercial clients, the bank will have a GSA.
Yes, yeah. And again,
or quite often as well, will be business lending secured by residential property. Again, they would have recourse against the property, wouldn't they? So it's not a way around.
And by the requirement of needing to be 50% value, that inherently means you're nearly always going to have the bank on side with this proposal anyway. It's just the way the cookie crumbles.
Yeah. Before we give Mike the centre stage, just another couple of things. Doesn't apply to wage payments, and so it doesn't apply to wage payments. Won't apply to lending that has first ranking, any rank of security under the PPSR. There was another one as well. New debts. You just want to explain the distinction between old and new debts, because I understand that it won't apply to new debts that have been accrued.
Sorry, is that going to Mike?
I thought that was one for Julian, but
Sorry.
I haven't looked at the business debt hibernation scheme in detail, Shane. You'll be very pleased to know I have found something new to say about the commercial lease situation, amazingly, given how much we've covered that. But I was interested, when I had a brief look at the business debt hibernation scheme, I was interested, and this new debts question might address it, so I'd be interested in hearing more about it. What kind of legislative protection is there to stop people practically, when they're entering into any kind of contract at the moment, insisting on some sort of personal liability or personal security? Because it's only applicable to companies, as I understood it.
Yeah, that's actually, just tagging on to that last part. It's a good point to raise, that it is things for entities like companies and trusts. And if you're a sole trader, for example, the protection isn't provided there, obviously, because the finance is basically treated as your own.
Just in the few, and someone like Brent Norling at Norling Law would be a better person to ask about the real ambulance at the bottom of the cliff situations where they are insolvent and they're also a big enough business and have enough debt, dare I say, that it would necessitate someone like Brent getting involved. But the situations we've dealt with, which are kind of pre-ambulance and bottom of the cliff, maybe dangling off the
you still got a good few fingers on the cliff.
Yeah, you've fallen through all the trees and all of the rocks and hit your head a few times, but you've just on the movies managed to get that hand onto the cliff.
Last full placeholder.
Yeah. And that situation is that, practically speaking, the month doesn't give people a lot of time anyway. So our advice for those people has been, well, yes, there is protection for that month, and yes, the whole fact that there is that protection should and has, in the situations we've been involved in, required all of the interested parties or the creditors to get together with the debtor and actually figure out exactly where everything's going. And so I think it becomes more a practical question of what are the creditors' attitudes towards the business, and how can the business sell the creditors on their vision or their forecasting and what they're going to do to turn around and convince them that, but for COVID and the struggles that are COVID specific, we are still a viable going concern and we're able to actually get this whole journey back on track. Now, I think that is a more important practical way of mitigating the position than any protection of the legislation. Much in the same way, before we hand over to Mike, I'll just say this, much in the same way that the wage subsidy only goes as far as allowing you to pay a portion of your wages during that time. It's not actually a solution going forward for actually allowing the business to. I mean, it's a welcomed intervention in terms of it gives you cash that otherwise you wouldn't have had, that you don't have to pay back. So I'm not sounding ungrateful on the behalf of all the people, including myself, who take subsidies, but at the same time, it's only a very short, medium term stopgap to build back bandage solution to what is the real problem.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also maybe as well, you guys would like to talk, when Mike after talked about leases, talk a little bit about the cumulative effect or the aggregate effect that all of these lockdowns sprinkled over the last 15, 18 months have actually had on businesses as well. And I don't, it would be only anecdotal and from the interactions we have daily with our clients. But I know for a lot of the hospital businesses, it's just like, death by 1,000 paper cuts, because it's just so tough. You get going again. I have a shareholding in a hospitality business with my business partner, Wayne Crone. And Wayne and I were talking the other day about how it is challenging. It's so challenging. Like you think about it, for a hospo business, you went through all the doldrums last year, you get the doors open again, you get going really well. But if your fixed costs are, your fixed costs. And so over a 12-month period, we're just looking at some of the financials the other day for our business the other day, if you have a month or two where you're shut down, that's your whole GP gone. So that has a pernicious effect on the viability of the business going forward. It's the sprinkled lockdowns through this period it's really had a pernicious effect on the viability of the business.
I think just you mentioned it sort of at the start of what you're just talking about in terms of that whole month and thinking, well, how am I going to get these people on board? And it's trying to sell the viability of the business. And I think it actually is, that's almost one of those first steps you actually have to think of before you even really start going down that whole regime is the business, is this viable really? Because that's pretty much a main feature of the regime, and that it has to be, and the directors will have to sign a certificate to the best of in their good faith belief that the business is viable. But it's an important thing to start off at, because with all these decisions like the Mainzeal, and there's that Debut Homes one recently at the end of last year, it's just becoming really, really difficult and potentially quite risky for a director, if they don't genuinely think that there's a viable business here, to all of a sudden start falling down on reckless trading, incurring obligations when they know they're not going to be able to be met. And it just sort of opens up a whole can of worms. And the regime really shouldn't be used, obviously, in a way to sort of circumvent or try sort of game the system in a way to sort of just get around debts you wouldn't have to have paid, or sort of just try to defer them. It really is just making sure that a viable business can just sort of navigate the sort of tumultuous sort of waters that COVID's sort of throwing in there.
Isn't that a little bit of what we talked to Sam Jeffs, our colleague down at Bankside Chambers, about? Isn't that we talked to Sam about the article that Peter Watts wrote, and about, I can't exactly remember the exact content of it, but Peter Watts has obviously written about that Debut Homes decision and about the effect that the various legislation has had. The effect that decision will have as a precedent going forward for directors that are really in the grey area as to whether they're trading recklessly or not.
Yeah, because it seemed like one of the things after I read it that they really seemed to really drill home, the Supreme Court, was the fact that it's all about solvency. The Companies Act is all about solvency. That's really the name of the game. And really the sort of the thrust of that sort of decision seemed to say, as soon as your company is insolvent, really the director should be basically sort of putting his hands up and saying, okay, there's formal procedures that need to be done here. I, being a director, am probably not in the best place to be making absolute decisions on the company's direction when it's insolvent. So they sort of really drilled home, I think, in that case, the director who sort of said, look, although ultimately he was possibly trying to maximize the amount left for creditors, it was a decision that he was driving and making, as opposed to sort of putting to creditors and using those formal procedures in the Act. And they really didn't, and the Supreme Court really didn't seem to like that.
Yeah, I mean, the reality from some of those scallywags that we deal with, and and they're lovable rogues indeed, but I mean, these guys are just, you said to a client, this is just, it might not be politically correct to say it, but if you see someone in that position, and if they've got everything on the line, do you really think they're going to have regard to, say, the Supreme Court's opinion as to whether or not they're going to be deemed reckless They're just going to go for it, and they're going to hope that at the end of it, that decision in terms of weighing up, they need to weigh up whether or not their position would be materially far or exponentially worse after they've gone for it than it would for stopping there and then. And I suppose that if the courts are starting to say, well, like you said with Mainzel and Debbie Holmes, that these directors are actually guilty of trading recklessly and will suffer the penalties under the Act for that, and they are fair, will we get to the situation? How long does it take for those decisions to trickle down into the consciousness of commercial lawyers like all of us and our clients? Not only in that calculus of when you're deciding whether or not to keep going, do you need to figure out whether it's worth it in terms of getting further in debt? There could also be really punitive measures waiting for you at the end of all this, particularly if you are a business of any kind of magnitude.
Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, I think that's about right. There's always with these things, there's got to be a practical analysis of the situation, and there's a level of risk that is inherent in that you can't really avoid. I mean, that leads in a little bit to the commercial lease situation, because obviously, if you're a small business and you're struggling to meet your debts as they fall due, one of your first analyses practically has to be, who can I stop paying, and for how long? And the commercial lease situation, obviously, your rent is for many businesses one of your big outgoings. Now, anyone to whom this is relevant will probably already know that the most common lease, New Zealand, the ADLS lease, clause 27.5, has a provision dealing with no access periods like the present lockdown. And just as a reminder for everyone, the basic test is that if you're unable to gain access to the premises to fully conduct your business, then a fair proportion of rent ceases to be payable. Now, obviously, since the previous lockdown, there's been a lot of time for case law to develop and for legislation to change, but neither of those things have really occurred to any major extent. There's been very little case law, but there has been one case that is somewhat interesting. It's Coffee Culture Franchisee Limited versus Home Straight Park Trustees Limited. And this case didn't really address what fair proportion means. That's still up for grabs. But basically what happened is it was a small business that it was a coffee shop basically on the first floor of a big building, and the main tenant in the building was IRD. So most of the custom for the shop were employees of IRD. When the country moved from level 3 to level 2, IRD made the decision not to bring back the majority of its staff. So this business continued to be way down in terms of trade post level 3. And what they argued at the High Court is that clause 27.5 should be construed to mean that your access to your customers is impeded rather than the access to the premises, which is a real stretch when you read the words of the provision, which clearly says access to the premises. But the High Court bought this to some degree. So there's now a authority that is strongly suggestive that level 1 and level 2 is a period where this no access clause may continue to apply, at least for certain businesses. And I mean, that's interesting, particularly in the context of the fact that there really hasn't been any significant case law on this. I mean, what that tells you is that landlords are reluctant to pursue these matters through the courts and to put that provision to the test. They're preferring to take practical, pragmatic sort of approaches to this. So really it suggests to me that if you're a tenant in that position, particularly in light of that case, there's it's certainly worth trying it on in terms of what you can achieve in terms of a rent reduction and how long that goes for.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, particularly given the cost and the energy that it would take in that case versus the quantum of what would be at stake with the relatively short periods people have been locked down.
That's right.
It would need like the case you talked about, a kind of red herring type of situation for that to come about.
Yeah, I think if you're a landlord, you're going to be pretty unlikely to want to go there, given that the matter hasn't been determined. It's anyone's guess what kind of analysis the court will apply to determine what fair proportion means. There are some commentators who think that could mean a full abatement, for example, and that's not a completely indefensible position. So, given that you're talking about relatively low amounts of money, for at least most people in the scheme of things, very high costs for litigation and then that level of risk, landlords are going to be quite open to negotiated outcomes here.
What we've done, and that's actually Liam's brainchild, was for some of our landlords lately, when he's been drafting leases for our clients, he's actually put in a clause to the effect that here's the percentage that you agree that will actually be abated in the lockdown, say 30%, 40%, whatever. And I think, Liam, you also have, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to show you up here, but I'm pretty sure you told me that you have, just shows how much I check my junior's work, which is very irresponsible of me. Now, Liam's about to become a director soon, actually, so he doesn't need his work checking. He probably needs to check my work these days. But I think, Liam, we talked about it one day, and I may not have been listening, or at least I was probably half listening, was you're saying that you have something in there as well that where they agree that is fair in the circumstances. Because that takes out any kind, so they acknowledge this is the percentage and they agree. They've had and they agree, which really
they've had robust discussions and whatnot to just basically plug any hole for them to sort of say, look, actually, we didn't agree this, or I made this agreement in a rush decision or something like that. Just anything to bolster an agreement that this is how much we agree is a fair abatement.
It's good.
Very sensible. Another thing like that one could do, if your lease is already locked in and has just the standard clause, is when you're having a negotiation with your tenant, you might hold to a reasonably conservative notion of what fair is, but then be prepared to offer an abatement over and above that level, where the consideration for going beyond what you consider fair is some sort of modification to the lease terms. So particularly if you're looking at a situation where the lease is about to come up, you don't want to be trading goodwill for a tenant who could very likely leave in the short term, because we know that's clearly on the horizon, a lot of empty premises.
Anything else?
Well, another area you mentioned, Shane, the whole wage subsidy thing. There's been a bit of movement there around the law. So you'll recall with the last lockdown, the government suggested that the wage subsidy should be used to ensure that employees are paid at least 80% of their present salary. And that was an interesting comment, because obviously it raises the implication that maybe as long as you're paying 80% of their salary, you're meeting the law, or that there was some sort of implied ability to, vary what you're paying them in light of the wage subsidy. So you had quite a few businesses throughout the country who took the wage subsidy and reduced their employees' salaries by 20%. And obviously that's contentious. There's now been a few cases have made their way through the court. But the position, it's really interesting a year on. Here, as with the lease thing, all the ambiguities that were informing the kind of playing field for negotiation a year ago are largely still in place. So there's been two ERA decisions. One of them's Bates and Major Motors, where the ERA has said, look, you can't unilaterally vary people's employment contracts in light of the wage subsidy to pay them less than what they're owed. But then there's an employment court case, so a higher authority case, that involved Gates Gourmet New Zealand Limited. And in that case, the court believed that the minimum wage provisions, those protections don't apply in light of the wage subsidy. So that's kind of opened the door to the idea that employers who are going to reduce what they're paying employees on the basis that they've had to retain them.
They're not on a principled basis. They're not linked.
No, I agree with you. I think that there's very really very limited. Well, there's no connection logically, and legally it doesn't make much sense. The argument, I suppose, would be that the practical reality of the situation is that businesses are under such pressure that if they have to meet everybody's salary obligations, they may not be able to continue to trade.
That's a different argument, though, which has got no bearing on the wage subsidy.
Well, I agree.
And it's a viable argument in many cases. You say to your employee, shit, would you rather be out on the street, or would you rather take, we've employed you for 10 years or whatever, you've been a great employee. At the moment, this is brutal. Say in the case of a good hospo business, then we're going to pay you what the wage subsidy gives you. It's really either that or we can't continue to employ you because we're stuffed. And what are you going to do? If it's couched in those terms, it's much less disingenuous. It's much more real. And if it's true, you'd hope it would be, if the employer is selling that whole proposition to the employee, then it's actually no one's got any reason to be aggrieved about it, not even the employee. Mm-hmm. But it's trite, in my opinion, to go and say, because the subsidy endorses this, you must pay at least 80%. Here's your wage. It's like, well, it's not great for employee relations, is it?
No, I agree with that. I think it's the fact that this decision's kind of opened the door to that argument potentially flying is unfortunate because, as you say, like in many cases, that argument that, look, I can pay you 20% less than what I'm meant to, or I can structure you out. Like that's a viable argument. It could be motivated by real economic pressures. But it's a very hard thing for an employee to ascertain the truthfulness of that kind of analysis. And obviously they're in a position where, faced with the prospect of wholesale unemployment, their bargaining power is limited. So that's why those kind of protections ordinarily exist. But at this point, that's certainly an area where there's significant ambiguity.
It's a moving target, really, isn't it? I mean, the last thing I think we should touch on is what will be if Auckland's locked down for a prolonged period. It seems that we will be if this. I mean, I don't read much into it. I try and focus on just what I can control. But if this Delta thing is so much more contagious, and if the rollout is slow, like all the opposition saying. I mean, at what point? It seems almost pointless to have even locked us down if they're not going to ride it out to the point that they don't stop it spreading, which means that theoretically we're going to be locked down for a month, 6 weeks. Then I wonder what, without weighing into what we all think about that, which is a far more controversial subject. It's not what we're here to talk about in terms of the economic effect of it and the law that wraps around that economic effect. That could be a pretty harrowing tale if we jump back on here in a week or two, if we're still locked down.
Well, it's certainly going to be very disruptive. Like I saw there was a good article on NBR about a week ago from the Reserve Bank governor, which really went into a lot of detail about why house prices were likely to come down. And unlike many of these articles, it was backed by very credible data about the supply side picture and the number of houses being built.
Yes.
And it sort of forecasts that by, within reasonably short order, as a consequence of supply increasing and interest rates going up, we'd see modest drops at least by sort of mid next year.
Yeah, saw that.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I mean, my personal view is a lot of that's going to be thrown into question. Obviously, the supply side thing is still going to be, there's still going to be a lot of new supply coming online. But like you'll notice that ANZ has reversed its increases to interest rates. This thing costs 1.5 billion a week. And, I think if you look at the number of cases that we've had to date, and compare it with the last lockdown, which we had, 4 weeks of level 4, 6 weeks of level 3 and 4.
Yeah.
I think we could be in for at least the same this time.
Yeah.
And they're going to have to fund that somehow. The chances that we get more quantitative easing and all the flow-on effects of that are reasonably high.
It's quite ironic how they were going to, all the commentators thought that they were going to increase the OCR, and it was the day that we got locked down again.
Mm-hmm.
It's good.
Yeah, pretty.
The jokes write themselves. The jokes write themselves sometimes.
Before we wrap this little soiree up, we've got a couple of comments. One's on the YouTube channel. Believe it or not, we have a YouTube channel. It took me ages to figure out how to put it together. We don't get a lot of love on it, but it is a channel nonetheless. Daniel Maxwell. The CDC revealed in 2020 that face masks do not stop the spread of viruses. A 2015 study in the inverted commas, British Medical Journal showed how face masks increase the risk of catching a respiratory illness. I don't think we need to give that the time of day, do we?
I can't really think of legislature which really addresses.
The thing that can be said to that is that, of course, wearing face masks is not about personal protection. It's true, the science is pretty clear that wearing one doesn't stop you getting the virus. It might even increase your chances of getting the virus. What it does do is it significantly diminishes your chances of spreading the virus. So if everyone's doing it, you get a very fractional increase to your risk of getting the virus due to the fact you've got the mask on, and a massive decrease to your risk of getting the virus due to the fact that no one else is breathing all over you. So that's the basic calculus.
As only Mike could do. That was a very Moughan explication. That
yeah,
was
you really
unnecessary, because it sounds like I'm cutting him down, but it wasn't really a serious question. But thanks. There's actually a more serious question though that's just come in from James Ashwin at Kakapo Business Sales. He says, has anyone had run-ins with Adrian Orr? ? He cut me off in traffic the other day. Anyone?
can't say I've seen him on this side of the shore.
Adrian Orr, what do you know? All right, guys, thanks for coming on. It's been great to get back on the airways. Michael, enjoyed Devonport. Like that cluster, Liam. You're the almost park ranger of Tor Bay, I hear.
Yep.
Rolling the streets, big on masks.
Gallivanting around, responsibly, of course.
Sprinkling of legal work every now and then.
Dabbling. We're trying.
Right, team. I don't know. At the beginning, when I was trying to play that music, the lockdown song, was that actually coming out? Because I don't think I had the.
I got it loud and clear.
Oh, you did. Oh, that's good. So let's fire it up again. For the exit.
One more for posterity.
Yeah, one more for posterity. Where it is. Here we go. It's the outro.
Just like that.
There we go, guys. Lateral Lawyers Podcast.
Awesome. Another one for the books.
Another one from Devon Lane. What an operation we're running here today. Thanks, guys.
Oh, and article.
Yeah.
I'll be just before we go, so we'll be publishing just an article about the regime, the hibernation regime, just later this afternoon. So make sure you have a look at that.
On that. I hadn't heard a lot about it.
What's that?
I thought you were hibernating on that. I hadn't heard a lot about it.
No, well, so 50% of the creditors didn't vote for it, so alas. I'm back to the coalface in it.
Thank you, guys.
All good. See ya.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.